Hello, Dark Journalist. How are you doing?
How are you, Andrew?
I am well, thank you. Where are you talking to us from today?
I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts, so right outside of
Oh,
Boston here.
okay. I believe that's a part of America that's like the most similar to the UK in some respects.
Absolutely. Everything around here is named after you guys. So we're even New
Yeah,
England. Think about it.
that's it. That's exactly it. I think I've heard it's very beautiful there as well. Tell me a little bit. So, Dark Journalist, do you give your real name out, or do you stay anonymous because of the nature of your work?
No, it's Daniel List.
Ah,
And basically, this kind of work, I think that if you have some chops as a journalist, you can move through it all. But most of my stuff is under dark journalist. And,
okay.
for me, that's just a kind of journalism. So if you want to get through to the truth, you're using dark journalism as opposed to kind of mainstream methods.
Oh, so dark in that respect means alternative, or maybe does it also mean using sort of devious means to collect information that otherwise would not be possible to extract?
I don't know about devious. That's interesting. I would say you go to dark places in order to get the stuff. Yes, for sure. And
Hmm.
very often, I mean, my experience in general with the media is certain types of stories get up to a point, and you think they're going somewhere, and then there's that choke point, chokes off the story, and everybody in the newsroom goes back to what they were doing.
Hmm.
And so if a publisher doesn't want something, if a New York Times publisher says kill it, that's it. We never hear about it. That's why the alternative media is so crucial, as you guys understand.
Yeah, I mean, and is that a big concern? Do you find that the mainstream media is particularly has moved to one side or the other politically in recent years?
Oh, it's an incredible shift. I mean, it's dramatic. They've always been, shaping the narrative. The CIA has been deeply involved with the media since its inception in 47. So they've always had that aspect. But once you got to the Trump election in 2016, they just threw everything out and just went, hardcore. And so they were so dedicated to get one narrative going. And that's kind of a inside political war that spread out to the media. And at this point, the media is, a lot of people, and I've discussed this with people who watch MSNBC and some of the real traditional stuff, because they really think they're getting the real thing. But, those companies are controlled by pharmaceutical companies, the war machine. They're not going to give you the truth. They're not, public access
Yeah.
doing it voluntarily. So we have a wrong idea about the news. Those are paid players. One of the things that RFK Jr. told me when he came on my show was that certain individuals in the media, like Anderson Cooper, not only are they sponsored via CNN, they're sponsored individually by certain companies. So, like Pfizer will sponsor Cooper as an individual. So, when we get into that, you're no longer able to critique and criticize these people, and that's no longer news. So, my theory on that basically is if you're in the truth telling business and you can't tell the truth, you get out of the business. And that's really where I find ourselves on this. And of course, in relation to the JFK assassination, that's kind of the classic case for this.
Mm. Well, I'm going to get onto that in a second, but I'm just thinking. So I guess you're suggesting it's moved very far left, particularly MSNBC and CNN, for example. I look at the UK, and there's the BBC and Channel 4 have also moved quite far left, or seem to at least have been taken over by the left or the woke side of the culture wars. But you also do have Fox News. In the UK, we have GB News, which is a sort of imitation in some ways of Fox News. So isn't it just a case of, both sides are moving both ways?
Yeah, I think they'll use either side for what they want to do. So
Mm.
right now they might be really using the left side and dominating with that. Here in America, the DNC and the media are exactly like that. There's just no difference between them. And Fox and those types of networks, although they're the conservative networks, there's still stories they won't touch. They don't want to talk about the Federal Reserve.
Ah,
And their hosts wear CIA pins. I mean, so they're not going to get at real stories either. So that's kind of
what's the
feeding the
Federal Reserve?
marketplace. Yeah.
What is the Federal Reserve?
The Federal Reserve, that's the kind of main central bank in America that controls the money flow. And, it's been at the heart since 1913 of a number of scandals and problems in this country and around the world. And they're the guys who just keep printing the money.
Oh, Right.
You guys have the
Okay.
Bank of England. We have the Federal Reserve.
Yes. Interesting. Okay, and that's untouchable, whether left or right, because of the powers that be. Hey, did you hear much about? Did you get to hear any of what Mark Shaw was saying about JFK?
Oh yeah, yeah. I like Mark Shaw a lot. I think he does interesting work, and there's an aspect in his work that he doesn't even realize he's uncovered.
Ah, go on, go
Which is
on.
well, Dorothy Kilgallen and Marilyn being close on that. It's been rumored for years that it was JFK who told Marilyn about UFO secrets, and those are the things that he said to Kilgallen. And everyone is so hung up on the kind of Cuba Soviet aspect or anti-Castro Cubans when they look back. A lot of that stuff is a cover story, and the real central piece in the JFK assassination is actually the UFO aerospace file. And
Wow.
that's the piece that's been missed. In my own work, I had the Watergate lawyer Douglas Caddy come on the program, and he was the lawyer for the Watergate 7, and he was best friends with E. Howard Hunt, who was the top spy master in the JFK era. And before Hunt went off to prison for Watergate, in private, he talked to Caddy, and Caddy said, "What happened with the JFK thing? Why did the CIA assassinate President Kennedy?" And he said, well, the CIA assassinated him because he had to be removed because he was about to give our most vital national security secret to the Russians. And he said, what do you mean? Why would he do that? What's the secret? And he said, the UFO file, the alien presence.
Wow.
So that conversation is sitting there in history. And there's a major historical figure. So very often in the UFO field, you get these guys, I'm a whistleblower, I had an encounter, I saw something. This guy's a Watergate lawyer. So that's a lot different. So we have that historical heft of somebody saying that it was over the UFO file. When you dig back through that, you start to realize the UFO file is all around the JFK assassination. And so when you get into like the mafia and the Cubans and things like that, I mean, Cubans or the mafia can't change autopsy reports. They can't go into the government and have the ballistics changed. I mean, that's a totally different type of operation. So when we get into people like the Cubans or the mafia, those are foot soldiers who are around the fringe. That has nothing to do with the actual case. And so that's the big kind of untouchable thing when it comes to this. You see stories occasionally. There'll be little, because memos come out that JFK wanted all the UFO files 10 days before his assassination. And those are memos that are on record. So that's kind of where we're at. The problem is the UFO secrecy is overlapped on the JFK assassination. So those two are really untouchable. And I think the nature of the problem that we have right now with the UFO file research is, you see these hearings in America, but they don't touch on anything real. This is CIA disclosure. It's like a parody disclosure that they want to build a threat narrative, which is totally different from actual disclosure, which is the kind of thing that President Kennedy was looking for. That's 1963. That's 58 years ago. And they're still hiding his records.
Wow.
So think about that. Why are you going to hide somebody's
Yeah.
records 58 years later?
Because of the UFO stuff. So
Yes.
would you agree then, just to go almost off topic but stay on topic, would you agree that maybe Marilyn Monroe was assassinated by the Kennedys, but then not agree that it was this Marcello who killed Bobby Kennedy, that it was actually the government to stop him spreading the UFO stuff?
The CIA assassinated both of the Kennedy brothers. So the CIA used the mafia. It came out in the 70s in the Church Committee and in these Pike Commission and these different commissions that they did. They realized, they used the mafia for hire. So you can always have mafia people around, but that's scenery, basically. I mean, the Central Intelligence Agency has assassination programs. Recently, before they grabbed Assange, as you know, they wanted to assassinate him. And who did they send in for the job? The CIA. I mean, they're still doing it. And Kennedy, when he got into office, if you look at some of those early kind of briefings that he had, if you go back and you read what his aides were hearing from him, he was like, I can't believe the Central Intelligence Agency has the ability to go over to Laos, to go over to Vietnam and do these things on their own, and that they have their own Air Force, So he wanted to get that back under presidential control. But he also wanted the UFO file back under presidential control. And that's a really big problem for them. It still is.
Why is it so important for the CIA to prevent the UFO files from getting out? What might happen if that falls into the wrong hands, or if we were to find out the truth about it all?
That's the real question. Why are they hiding it that hardcore? There's a good school of thought that says the National Security Act and the creation of the CIA was exactly because of the Roswell crash and exactly because of the early UFO incidents and the UFO wave, that they created this thing where they could move all that information through these different government agencies. Certainly they have a lot to do with it, but it has something to do with the CIA on one side and the aerospace corridor, that defense contractor piece of Lockheed Martin and Boeing. So they've been involved for a long time as kind of a separate pseudo government going right alongside the regular government. So you have an overt government up here ruling things, the president, the Congress, and all that. And then you have the covert government. And the way that that thing operates without the media being able to get at it is the excessive levels of secrecy. And, you know, in many cases, I'll tell you, as people that I know in journalism, if you want to make it, you have to make friends with the CIA because they have people all over the world. So if you want a real story on foreign policy, if you don't make friends with the CIA, they can make or break your career. And so therefore, those people are never going to turn on them and be like, you know, unless you get like a Glenn Greenwald or somebody like that, who's very aware of the nature of the situation. But the ironclad grip of the Central Intelligence Agency on the media means you'll never get the truth on the UFO thing. And you'll certainly won't get the truth on the JFK assassination because they had decided this guy's too much of a threat. We need to remove him. And they're not going to out themselves. They still have his records 58 years later. The records are mandated by Congress now in 1992. And they were mandated to come out 25 years later. That's 2017. And I was live streaming at the time because I thought the records are going to come out. And they blocked them at the last minute, October 26, 2017. And the reason was, oh, it's a national security issue. Well, what could be a national security issue? The Soviet Union doesn't even exist anymore. So they're still hiding something in those records. And actually, there is something valuable in those records. A lot of people said, well, you know, what are you going to get in records anyway? And I understand that. But recently, someone over here who's very popular on these different shows named Judge Andrew Napolitano. He does major media shows. And he's like a libertarian. You know, I mean, Fox has had him on, you know, so he does all these kind of mainstream shows. But he talked about a conversation he had with Trump when Trump didn't release all the files, which is a big thing because Trump was like, oh, I'm going to release all this. And he said, no, you know, Trump said to me in this conversation, I can't release that stuff. You don't understand. If you knew what was in there, you wouldn't release it either. So whatever it is in those JFK files is absolutely explosive. My guess, it's a link directly to the UFO file.
Surely Trump would release, because he'd love to release that stuff. I can imagine he'd get a real, you know, being the guy who released it all. And also, like, I guess where I get a bit skeptical, and I'm not skeptical about what you're saying, but just about the whole UFO thing, it's just that there's a huge world out there outside of the States where UFOs might have landed. I mean, we talk about the Soviets. I mean, that's a huge amount of land, isn't it? Larger than the US, I think. It's like the biggest country in the world or something, one of them. It must have been, if UFOs were landing in the States, it's just as likely they would have been landing in Russia or in the UK or El Salvador, for that matter, or Chile or wherever it might be. So are all these countries conspiring together to prevent people from knowing? And how many people then are in on this secret? Surely it would have been outed by now.
Well, for example, in the Soviet Union, you had the Voronezh case just before they broke up, the Soviet Union. That's 1989. And in that case, that's a major report through media. Nightline had it on. And that's a case of two ships landing in a park and 300 witnesses, including children, seeing it, and them calling out the police to try to get the aliens, you know, and take them to jail. I mean, that's pretty major. So those stories have been there. The question is, what's the incentive, for example, for somebody to call this out? So if I'm China, why should I call out what I have on the UFO file when the United States keeps it a super secret? Or if I'm Russia, why am I going to reveal the technology that I've recovered? I might, you know, in the case of Russia, I'd say they're neck and neck with us, if not superior, on UFO recovery. So I don't think there's any incentive for them to say anything. The other thing is that the Central Intelligence Agency has made it their central tenet of secrecy. Co-intelligence is lying to the public in order to get them to believe something else. That's what you do with your enemies overseas. You know, that's been going on since World War II. And Hitler, we didn't want him to think we were going to land in Normandy, so we kept giving him this false story we were landing somewhere else. And that's the nature of co-intelligence, counterintelligence. So when you get to that point, that's what they're good at. So the Central Intelligence Agency are professional liars. So whenever you get around the UFO file, you know, they can dance on either side of that line. Right now, they're saying, oh, there's something in our space that's a threat. We need more money to study it. But 5 years ago...
I was just going to say...
Yeah, I was just going to say, one of their earliest... Oh, go ahead. One of their earliest tweets. That's called intercontinental delay. One of their earliest tweets was, remember all those UFOs you were seeing in the skies in the 50s, 60s, and 70s? That was us. We did it, right? So then back then they were saying 5 years ago that they had done the whole UFO wave. It was them and there are no aliens. Now their thing is, oh, there's a threat out there. You know, we stole $30 trillion of your money and we were fighting aliens. So just forget about it.
The thing I was going to say, the thing you're saying about Hitler and the government lying to us because they're professionals in secrets and co-conspiratorial stuff. That's really interesting because it plays on something we talked about last week on this show, because we had somebody on who was a former spy, Andrew Bustamante, who was saying that it's not necessarily a bad thing that the government do these kinds of secret things and that the public aren't allowed to know about them and that we're not privy to these secrets because, you know, look at the good that came from that particular tactic against the Germans, so against the Nazis, I should say. So is it sometimes right? And I know that's not a popular thing to say on this channel, but I'm just thinking out loud. Is it sometimes right that the government keep secrets from us?
Well, it's the extent of the secrecy and what it's for. And not if it's operating as an independent government of its own, which is beyond the reach of the average citizen. That's different. So, and also in the case of counterintelligence, that's supposed to be not against your own citizens, that's against other countries, you know, to keep them in the dark about the things that you're doing. So to use that on the American public is actually a major betrayal because they're set up to be part of the defense of the United States. The interesting thing is also that the Central Intelligence Agency, this is not often talked about, they're an extra constitutional agency. So in fact, their entire existence is illegal. So is the Department of Homeland Security. Department of Homeland Security has 250,000 employees. The CIA has their own Air Force, but technically they shouldn't exist because in the Constitution, you're set up for the defense of the United States and you set up a military to do that. So having an independent branch, you know, this is when Truman set up the Central Intelligence Agency. After the Kennedy assassination, he said, look, you know, either mend it or end it, reform that agency or get rid of it. It was never meant to go over and be overthrowing governments and blowing up trains and fixing elections. So the Central Intelligence Agency is a core problem. It's a growing problem. They're in the media. They're in this UFO threat piece. You know, the whole thing with Assange and assassination. Look at what they've done in Ukraine. In Ukraine, a few people inside the Central Intelligence Agency could get you into a nuclear war. So again, it all depends. You know, there has to be oversight in relation to these things. Of course, there's a certain amount of secrecy in relation to nukes and other things that are expected from the public. But when you get to this level, you know, then it's a totally different story.
What about the secret space program?
Well, this is crucial because this is very easy. Think about this. In 1972 was the last time we went to the moon. A manned mission. Now, we're 50 years later. Why haven't they gone back with a manned mission to the moon? This is the first question you ask. And what happened in between? So we had shuttles, unmanned probes, and all the rest of it. But what happened to the manned space program? Well, it's interesting because there's a guy in the UK who the United States wanted to get very badly named Gary McKinnon. And he had hacked into NASA. And he basically wanted information on UFOs and thought, maybe I can get in here. And he found that he could. Oh, yes. And you remember this guy? You're familiar with the story?
Yes, that's right. Yes, go on.
A very interesting guy.
Well, sorry, was he maybe just autistic or something? I don't mean to say the wrong thing. Right.
Yeah. They did, and it's Asperger's is what they said that he had, which is why they weren't able to extradite him. But you'll find that he comes up in a press conference when Obama went over to the UK with Cameron. And so they discussed the matter of extraditing Gary McKinnon for hacking into NASA. Well, what did Gary McKinnon say when he went looking for UFOs at NASA? It's pretty interesting. What he found were off-world officer lists of an entire different military that dealt with off-world things. So they've been building, the suggestion is the secret space program, they've been building a force over the course of that 50 years. And that's why you've had money disappearing out of the back of the government, what they call the missing trillions or the missing money. That's building a major infrastructure in space, and it's all been done in secret. And now who's ready to cash in on that stuff? That's where you get Bezos. That's where you get Elon Musk. And those guys, you know, are rolling right into a pre-made space infrastructure. That's a space program that's been built over 50 years with our money. So we haven't had any access to that. And where are all the missions from 1972 to 2022? They don't exist.
I suppose a skeptic then might say if somebody like Trump or somebody like Elon Musk, along with many, many other people, knew about this secret space program, it would be out there in a second. Musk can't keep quiet for a minute, can he, before tweeting everything out?
Well, he can't do anything out in space without the permission of the government. Nothing. Literally. If they're against him, he can't do anything. If the Central Intelligence Agency thought Musk were any kind of threat to their secrecy, he would have been washed up in a sex scandal 5 years ago. That would have been it. So, no, when you get on that level, you get briefed in that this is a national security area. So what they've done with space, and it's interesting with Trump, because you can see how they try to move the UFO file back under the purview from intelligence to the executive branch, and the Space Force was his attempt. Well, if I have a branch that's actually dedicated to space, then I'll be able to collect all the UFO info and bring that under the umbrella of the executive branch. They lost that ability. If you track the story back, Eisenhower into JFK, that was the fight over the UFO file, or what I call the war over the UFO file. It took place then. We're still looking at that in those congressional hearings now. But fundamentally what happened is they decided, you know what? We're going to move this out of the government into corporations like Lockheed and Boeing. And then when people do FOIA requests or investigations, they won't be able to touch it because it's not part of the government. So eventually that group with the CIA were just like, we have the technology, we have the research, you guys have a good time. And ever since, I mean, you have attempts, even Reagan with Star Wars, there's an attempt to get that back. So you have to look at the history in a way that's understandable. When you think about Trump and his gruff demeanor and wanting to get this stuff out, he said a few things, really, that indicated he wanted to go deep on the UFO file. But he can't, just like any of these guys, can't come out and say, yes, you know, we have the wreckage and we have this stuff, because they're busy trying to get that back from this shadowy corridor of defense contractors between the Central Intelligence Agency and the aerospace companies. That's the corridor that's not, no one gets at that. You know, even when we talk about the JFK thing, it's loaded with that. Oswald, one of the things he claimed to his fellow employees, he was going to work for NASA. You never hear about that. You always hear about Oswald, oh, the Cubans or whatever. No, he was around NASA. When he worked for Guy Bannister, who was a right-winger. So that's weird too. I mean, he's supposed to be a left-wing communist, but Bannister, if you go further enough back in his own career, he started the X-Files at the FBI. He did, you can find little newspaper reports of him checking out UFO reports and saucer reports, you know, in newspapers. So Guy Bannister then becomes Oswald's employee. So everywhere you go around the JFK thing, the UFO file is in your face. And that's the secret piece with the assassination. That's the reason they don't let the records out.
That's interesting. So I guess what we're learning here is that UFO stuff is actually supersedes the Cuban stuff in terms of a sort of hierarchy of secrets. And I mean, it's an exciting thought, isn't it? The secret space program, isn't that a really exciting thought? I would love, because I get the idea. I guess what that makes me feel, and maybe it's what makes the viewers feel. One day that you'll open the newspaper and there'll be loads about, yeah, all right, we admit it, we've got this big base out on like planet whatever, a few light years away, and there are aliens and stuff like that. I mean, what's the most exciting thing you think of when you think of the secret space program?
Well, it's incredibly suppressed. All right. So the things that they've found in relation to, there's a lot of reports that on the moon they found ruins. So that's a problem right away. What do you do if in the late 60s you find ruins on the moon? And you have a whole culture that's set up to think, oh, culture started in Samaria in 6000 BC. I mean, it is, it's a pretty big conundrum. They actually did a study on it for the Brookings Institute in the 60s. And they said, what would be the impact of ET life, the discovery of ET life? And they decided it would upend religious institutions, destroy the economy, et cetera. So they've always been very careful when they've done studies along this line. But I think that they know a lot more about space. They have a lot more. Let's go back to McKinnon for a minute. If his off-world officers lists, if that's why they wanted him so badly. So what does that suggest? It not only suggests you're sending probes out that are getting all this information, you've got a whole group of people who are 50 years ahead in terms of their space understanding. They've been out there, they've adjusted. They were talking about, oh, we're going to send the first woman into space. Do you really think that they haven't sent a woman into space? I mean, with the exception of the Soviets, the Americans definitely have already done this. And it is interesting. If you look at the timeline, when Trump was in, they had Pence saying, we're going back to the moon 2024. And then as soon as Biden gets in, it's no, it's not 2024, maybe 2028 or 2030. So they moved all of that around. So you can see these two groups grappling, trying to get a handle on the situation. But really, fundamentally, you look at it and you say, they stopped going to the moon. They were well funded. They'd already funded trips further out to the moon past 72. So under Nixon was the last manned mission. So what do you do with 50 years in between? That's where the secret space program is.
Fascinating, really fascinating. And we're running out of time. Do tell us where do you want people to go and find you and give you some love?
Darkjournalist.com and Dark Journalist on YouTube. And the documentary up there is X-Protect, Ufo File, Aerospace Assassinations.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh,
yeah. It was brilliant. Yeah. And you have a lovely day.